But I don't know. Can you like come tell us if they are? Okay, I don't want to open my stuff because I'm sharing my screen. So
we are now
you should be live everywhere now.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm also choking on my tea now too. So hi everyone. Sorry we're a little bit late. Of course, all the streaming key things never want to work for us, it seems. So welcome to our Ask an Expert live event on this lovely Saturday. So what is SASA? I'll just go into that since that's the one that's on the screen right away. SASA is Save Ancient Studies in America. Our mission is to reverse the current downward trend in the study of the ancient world by engaging the public and bringing together students and scholars to share their passion for the study of the ancient world in order to inspire a vast new generations of students. Basically, there is a downward trend in universities across the world in ancient studies, and in order to reverse that, we need undergraduate students to take more classes, because that is what funds classes at the university level, at least in America. Sorry, there we go. Where to find SASA, here are our social media handles. Mostly we post on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter basically every day during the week. And our live streams and other videos are saved on YouTube. Protocol for the event: please be kind and respectful, listen and ask thoughtful questions throughout the event. So after the speakers introduce themselves and stuff and kind of introduce the event a little bit, feel free to start sending in questions anytime. We really want to hear from you guys in the audience. Please be patient with our technology and those administering it. Thank you already. SASA live events are live streamed on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook. SASA live events are recorded and archived. The recordings will be posted on the platform shortly after the event once they're processed, and have fun. This is our event that we have today, Gender and Religion in Ancient Israel. And basically from this, I'm just going to hand it over to our hosts. So thank you for joining us, and here's Tina.
Great, thank you, Lauren. You can switch over to camera now. Thank you. So welcome everybody to our second, I believe, Ask an Expert panel Q&A of this year. My name is Tine Rassalle, and I am the host of this event, together with two lovely colleagues who will introduce themselves in a minute. So this is how this will go. So we have a set topic that we are going to discuss, but you guys that are watching can ask us questions. So you're either watching on Facebook or on YouTube or on Twitch. And so if you have any question at all, put them in the chat, and then we will get those questions and talk about it. We really want this to be an interactive experience where we answer your questions. That's why we're here for. We are experts on this topic, at least we try to be. And so we want to have an interesting conversation going, an interesting discussion. And we can only do that if we get your questions. So please feel free to ask us anything and everything. Like I said, my name is Tine, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And my specialization is the archaeology of ancient Judaism and early Christianity in the southern Levant, by which I mean Israel, Syria, Palestine, Jordan region. Every summer I excavate in Israel, and I'm very interested in especially the religious material culture. So early churches, monasteries, synagogues, and all the objects that go around with it. I am currently in the PhD program in religious studies. And I'm actually teaching a class on ancient Judaism. And if everything is okay, there should be students of mine on this session. So welcome, go UNC. Which I really enjoyed. This class is one of my favorite topics. So how did I get into my interest in the ancient world? Well, it's a long story, but I'm going to try to keep it short. I remember when I was 5 or 6 years old, that my mom would take me to the library and show me all these books with images of pyramids and Mesoamerican stuff. And I thought it was so cool. And so I asked my mom, like, what is this? And how do you study that? And how do you go and see those things? And my mom said, well, there's this field that's called archaeology. And if you study that, then you could travel to Egypt and you can travel to Mexico, and then you can research these buildings and look at them and be engaged with them. And I thought, wow, that is so cool. So I was about 6 years old when I said, I'm going to be an archaeologist. And I kind of stuck with it. And so in high school, I made like deliberate choices of like, okay, I probably should take Latin because that's good for an archaeologist. And I probably should work on my modern languages. And I probably should take a lot of history. And so that's what I did. And then when I was 18 years old, I had to go to university. And so I'm from Belgium originally. This is not my Southern accent, as you can hear. And so in Europe, how it works is we don't have gen eds. You just choose your field. And then every single class that you take is within that field. And so I immediately chose archaeology. And then I took archaeology of the Roman period, classical periods, prehistorical periods, Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. And then at some point I had to focus on a specific area. And I chose the Middle East, or the ancient Near East, because it sounded the most mysterious to me. I think we know a lot already about the Romans and the Greeks, but we don't know as much about the Assyrians or Sumerians, at least in common perception. And so I thought that would be more mysterious or exotic to go and study and get involved in that kind of world. And so long story short, I ended up studying that, getting my master's in archaeology of the ancient Near East. Then I moved to the Netherlands. I got another degree in Hebrew and Aramaic languages because I was more and more getting interested in the history of the Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the ancient Hebrews. And so I wanted to learn those languages, wanted to learn how to read inscriptions. And then I worked for a couple of years in a museum in the Netherlands, where I learned that I really like working with the general public, with you guys. I don't want to stay into academia where professors talk to each other about their research, but the general public has no idea what we're doing. And so what I really enjoy is taking our knowledge, our expertise, and sharing it with everybody who is interested in it. And so that can be in museums, setting exhibitions. That could also be in public talks like this. I'm also very much interested in video games. I also organize the Archeo Gaming video sessions at SASA, where we play games that are set in the ancient world, to educate people about, like, this is what architecture looked like at the time period, or this is the languages that they spoke. So that is kind of my passion, everything that I can do to get more people to know about the ancient world. So I'm very excited to be a part of SASA. And to come on here and talk about what I'm interested in. Okay, enough about me. Let's introduce our two other experts that I asked to come on. And let's start with ladies first, Miss Amanda Bauer.
Cool, thanks, Tina. Okay, so my name's Amanda Bauer. I did my undergraduate degree at University of Arizona. I had a double major, Judaic Studies and Anthropology. Currently, I'm finishing my master's thesis at UCLA, kind of working from home at the moment, like everyone. And I'm in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, focusing in Levantine archaeology. Specifically, my thesis is actually looking at one specific type of artifacts called these little female plaque figurines. They're about this big. I can pull up a photo later on. And I'm looking at their context in household archaeology, as well as their role, the roles that they play within gender, within women specifically. So I use a lot of feminism and looking at different ways that you function in a house and what we might know through the archaeological context. We can look at biblical text as well as other texts that we can find. And then I guess to go back even more, I've always loved history. I've always loved culture and people. And anytime I can talk to people, I'm always asking questions. When I was 13, I had a bat mitzvah, or became a bat mitzvah technically. So I knew at that point I'd already learned to read and write in Hebrew. And I thought, this might be important. I feel like somehow this will come up again in my life. So I stuck with it. I kept practicing and continued to learn. When I got to college for my first degree, I started taking modern Hebrew, fell in love with it, then started taking biblical Hebrew, also fell in love with it, and then added a double major. So I was just anthropology, didn't really have a focus yet, picked up archaeology, picked up modern Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, everything. And then I met my wonderful advisor from undergrad, Beth Alpert Nakai, and she just adopted me, and the rest is history, literally. This is what I'm studying. So yeah, that's kind of my story. Then I went to UCLA, so I just kept moving west. I was originally actually in a PhD program, and I'm happy to talk more if anyone has any questions, if there are any, curious archaeologists to be out there. I decided that it was better for me to finish my degree in Israel. So I actually recently just immigrated here, and I'm here videoing from Tel Aviv. I'm living in South Tel Aviv. So hello from Israel. It's 9:15 p.m. And I'll finish my PhD here.
Excellent. Cool. Thank you, Amanda. I look forward to your input in this discussion. Dr. Eric Trinka, you want to introduce yourself?
Certainly. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Tina. It's good to be a part of this with both of you. I wanted to give a shout out to my students who are tuning in for this, and also some members of my family, including my mom. Just want to give a shout out to Brenda Trinka. She doesn't always get a chance to see me give any kind of public lecture, so it's nice to have her participate in this way. So my entry into the field of biblical studies, I am a biblical scholar, it wasn't something that started as early in life as it did for Tina and Amanda. This was actually something that happened when I was most of the way through my undergraduate training, when I was already being prepared to be a public school teacher in social studies, particularly in geography, and I was teaching ancient cultures as well for about 5 years or so. And during my time as an undergrad, I had an experience, a 4.5 month long study abroad experience in the Middle East. That really piqued my interest, not only in that region of the world, but also into the realms of ancient history. And it became a kind of hobby of mine to just read about these places some more, to explore them. And I actually continued to return to those places after my undergraduate, leading various learning tours and taking people to see the archaeological sites that had been so influential in my life. And so it was through that kind of process that I began to think more seriously about graduate work in religious studies and specifically in biblical studies. And so I did a Master's of Religion with a focus in Hebrew Bible and a focus in biblical studies writ large. So I did both New Testament and Old Testament studies. And then I did my PhD at the Catholic University of America, also a PhD in biblical studies. But the appeal of social science has always been one that has remained in the present for me. And so part of what I do in my work as a biblical scholar is bring social scientific research to bear on how we understand the compositional histories of the biblical texts and also the various interpretive and reception histories of those texts. And so I'm always looking for ways to integrate sociology and anthropology to help us read those texts better. And that includes understanding their context of authorship and just the context of daily life of people who are both the authors of the biblical text, but also people who lived during that time who maybe weren't necessarily participating in the creation of those texts. So in my specific work, what I tend to focus on is migration studies and how migration is both present within the biblical text, but also a a world in which the biblical text emerges, that we see migration as a catalyst for the creation of religious literature around the world. And I really focus on that within the biblical period. The way that this interacts with some of the other modern scholarship that I do in religious studies is a lot of my work on migration and religion has extended into trying to understand the role that religion plays broadly in the lives of migrants. And so that has involved all kinds of other anthropological and sociological explanations and explorations as well. So I'm hoping to bring some of that to bear in our conversation as well today.
Right, thank you. Yeah, I think it's important to realize that, yes, we do ancient world studies, but it doesn't mean that this cannot be applicable to modern situations, right? We are looking at the past, but then we apply this to the modern world, or we think about similarities and differences and what we can learn from the past about our current world. Great. So I wanted to give a little bit of an explanation about this topic, gender and religion in ancient Israel, and what I understand under that. So first of all, Israel, when I say Israel, ancient Israel, it's not the same as the modern state of Israel, right? We're talking about the southern Levant, the area where the ancient Israelites, the ancient Hebrews moved into, or yeah, let's say moved into, at the time when they were still different tribes, but trying to live in a bigger region. So that includes Syria, Palestine, Jordan, a little bit of Egypt, that kind of region. And when I say ancient Israel, I'm talking about a time period from a couple of thousands of years before the time of Christ, the Bronze Age, where we kind of start, where the first tribes kind of settle and come up. And then we move into the Iron Age around 1200 BCE, when we know for a fact that the word Israel, the land of Israel, existed because we have it mentioned on a certain stele that people were talking about Israel. So that existed. So then we enter the time of the monarchies, King Saul, David, Solomon, the temple gets built. And then we have the Assyrian captivation, later the Babylonian captivation, and exile, where the temple gets destroyed, people go into exile, the Persians come up, take over, and people in my class in ancient Judaism know all of this, I hope. And then the temple gets rebuilt, and that's the beginning of what we call the Second Temple period. And for a while, the Jews under leadership of the Hasmoneans are independent, but then they get conquered again by the Romans, and then the Romans destroy the temple in the year 70 after Christ, and then that's the end of the Second Temple. The temple has never been rebuilt again, and that's kind of where we end ancient Israel. After that, we start more into rabbinics, and the rabbis come up, and synagogues gets constructed, and that's what we call late antiquity, which we can talk a little bit about, but that's more a different kind of Judaism than what we generally understand under ancient Israel. So that's kind of the place and the time period that we're going to talk about. And as you've heard, that's a very long period. So if we talk about gender, or we talk about women, don't think that it was the same for every single person throughout that entire region, throughout that entire time, right? We're talking about thousands of years. Remember how men and women were treated different in the medieval times compared to now. So there clearly were differences as well in that time period between thousands of years. So it's kind of going to depend on what were the circumstances in the beginning, what were the circumstances under rule of the Persians, the Assyrians, the Greek, the Romans, etc. So that's kind of the background information you need to know for our topic. So I think we're going to get started. We prepared a couple of guide questions and topics that we can talk about. But like I said, this is a free discussion. So if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and we can talk about that instead. But to get us going, I think we should first talk about social identity and what does it even mean to have a social identity, the social construction of identity. What is gender and how can we approach that for the ancient world? So let's start with that topic. Let me take it from there. Who wants to start? Eric?
First, we should.
Or Amanda?
Yeah, Amanda, I didn't know
I
if
think
Amanda
first
was,
we
go
can
ahead.
clarify. Yeah, okay. I mean, there's a difference between gender and sex. So just because we're talking about women versus men does not always equal female gender versus if you're more feminine or more masculine. So, I mean, that's always, it says my internet connection is unstable. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I think that's always an interesting question. And there's not really a direct way to see this in the archaeological context. I mean, how do we know who's a woman and who's a man versus what their gender identity might be? And this is interesting. We can only see, human remains and infer from that. So that's something I'm working with the household context and looking at these female figurines and just, gender identity and negotiating the roles of women specifically in the household and cultic contexts or religious contexts. Yeah, I don't know if someone wants to add or continue.
Yeah, I'll say a few things. So this is always a fun topic for me to talk about with my sociology and anthropology students that I teach. Amanda, thank you so much for making this differentiation for us between gender and sex. Sex is this biological terminology and gender is cultural terminology. And so one of the things that we have to do when we're talking about gender is think about conceptions of the self. We have to think about conceptions of the person. And we can use the terminology of personhood. But when we use this kind of framework for thinking about individuals, we have to remind ourselves that our social context, primarily in the West, we have a very individualistic understanding of the person, that we are a kind of self-contained entity who gets to decide who we are, what we do. We think of ourselves with this kind of greater amount of agency. And that way of thinking doesn't always have purchase in the ancient world. So one of the things that we have to do is think about on one level, how people thought differently about the self, but then it's helpful to also think about the way that society and culture are socially constructed and how we as persons, we participate in something that we would call discursive identities, meaning we come to a better understanding of who we are through our interactions with other people. And so those people, they determine in some respects who we are. They determine how we think about ourselves in some ways, and we have influence or purchase on who they are as well. And so it's a very complex set of processes. But when we think about identity negotiation, it means that we're thinking about those social aspects of the human experience. And so defining the self is not simply something, as my students are very used to hearing me say, something that takes place only in our minds, but it's about our bodies. It's about our bodies being in contact with other people. It's about the way that we communicate, we interact, we establish systems of power, so on and so forth. So that's part of what is really at the core of this conversation about gender and identity in the ancient world.
Right. Yeah, I find it interesting that you say that it's a social construct because, for example, in archaeology, for a long time when skeletons would be excavated and they would have earrings, people would say, these are women, right? Because that's our common conception that it's the women who wear a lot of jewelry. But then actually, as our scientific technology gets better, we can do more research on these skeletons. They realize that they are actually men. And so some men wore a lot of jewelry in the olden days, and some men had earrings. And we know from the Hebrew Bible, for example, that sometimes when they would have slaves, they would pierce their ears to indicate that they were a slave of someone. And so that has a completely different meaning from, I'm wearing earrings because I'm a girl or a woman and I want to show my femininity through that. So I think it's very dangerous to put these modern conceptions, Western conceptions on like, okay, this is how a woman would have looked like in the ancient world. And this is what she would have worn, how she would have behaved. If there's makeup in a grave, it's a woman. If there's a spinning tool in a grave, it's a woman, right? But we don't actually have proof that it was women who wore makeup. That's just our assumption. So
I would also add, the opposite, how men are always seen as with weapons and swords and all of these different things. But I mean, it's not found in just men's tombs and graves. So it goes the same way. You can have female warriors as well.
Yeah, for sure. I'm writing for the moment a paper on representation of women in strategy video games. And a lot of strategy video games only have male warriors. Age of Empires, Civilization, they're all men. And so for a long time, people have said, well, that's because it's historically accurate. Why would we have female warriors in our games? And now more and more, we're starting to read and understand and learn that not a lot of women, but a decent amount of women were actually involved in warfare. And there are multiple cultures that we know of where women were participating in some sort of form of battle. And yes, women were sometimes buried, especially in like Germanic tribes, buried with their weapons. So yeah, these kind of assumptions are our mental constructs that we make. There are inventions that we place upon the past.
I'm wondering if anyone watching right now, does anyone have any assumptions that they want to bring up to ask us about? Like, we've talked about earrings and weapons so far. Is there another assumption that someone might want to address? You can, if you do this later, if you're catching up, feel free to drop whenever.
Right. So if we think about ancient Israel, if we cannot make those assumptions, what are the assumptions that we do know? What is it that we know from the Hebrew Bible and from archaeological finds that were specifically male tasks or specifically female tasks? And we're not talking here about non-binary people and all of that, just as a caveat, which is a very interesting topic. And scholarship is only just starting to begin to understand this sociological concept in ancient Israel. But let's stick for now with male and female. Eric, you are a biblical scholar. What do we know from the Hebrew Bible on that topic?
Yeah, this is one of those moments where my students maybe get sick of hearing me say these kind of things, but it's almost like your Facebook status sometimes. It's complicated. When we think about gender roles as they're represented in the Hebrew Bible, what we're thinking about is that there are both, on one level, we see fairly stark differences between masculine and feminine roles that might be understood by those authors of the text to be the ideals of social organization. So on one level, we have the ideals of masculinity and femininity, but we also have various texts that either intentionally or perhaps maybe less intentionally subvert those ideals. So the complication is that you might have biblical characters that represent what is sometimes termed hypermasculinity. People like David, who are associated, they're understood as being the warriors who make things happen through their savagery. And then people like Samson as well might be a part of that in terms of that hypermasculinity. But they're balanced out by other feminine warrior characters like Yael and Deborah, or sometimes we see the inverse with feminine characteristics. Sometimes we see women like Jezebel, who would be considered rather ruthless and in a high position of power. So while we have these normative understandings of masculinity and femininity, there's no consistent representation in a way that biblical authors are trying to say, make maybe like a value judgment about which one of these things is better or worse, but it's more complicated and complex than that.
Right, and it's also complicated because the Bible is not one book, right? It's a library, it's a collection of books. So we have books from different time periods, from different authors with different opinions. So it's only natural that you will find discrepancies or contradicting opinions about these kind of roles.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what's so exciting or interesting to me when studying these texts is to realize that there's a conversation that's taking place between these various biblical authors about what they think about these parts of human identity negotiation. And so if we're paying attention to the fact that the Hebrew Bible is really, like you've said, Tina, a collection of texts, a library, then we can see that conversation unfolding across time and in different contexts. And these different perspectives on what is masculine, what is feminine, they come into bear in those kinds of conversations. I'm seeing some questions in the chat as well. Should we answer those directly as we get them, or is somebody else moderating those?
No, we can just answer as we get them. Because this one, for example, kind of ties on with this. Would you say that ancient Israelite women were subservient? And I kind of want to give my opinion. So, like we said, the Bible is a very diverse book, and I think you can find in it whatever you want to find. So, yes, there are examples of subservient situations. Where people were not allowed to speak, or like they're not allowed to talk up in synagogue, whatever. That's New Testament. But then you also, especially in the beginning of the Bible, have a lot of examples where women did have power. And speaking from archaeology, for example, we have wedding contracts, so marriage contracts from 2600 before Christ, like a long time ago. Where a Jewish couple gets married, and in the marriage contract, there's a clause that says if the man wants a divorce, he needs to give back the money that the woman came with. So the woman came into the marriage with her possessions given by her father, or her own possessions, money, some materials, clothing, whatever. And when they get divorced, he needs to give that back so that she doesn't end up poor, right? She still has an option to remarry. First of all, divorce was allowed, apparently, according to these contracts. And second of all, she is not being treated as a secondary class citizen because of it. And even more so, a lot of these contracts also have a clause saying if the woman wants to divorce, she needs to give back what she got from her husband. So women apparently had the authority to divorce if they felt like that was necessary. And so I feel like over time, some of the very strict religious rules were not in place in the beginning and only developed after a amount of time. And so I think it's dangerous to think that ancient Judaism was very male dominant and women had to be quiet and had no roles, because we know from archaeology and the Bible that was not always the case. And I think, Amanda, you have more examples of that, talking about like religion.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think how to put this into words. And if we want to just jump into it, I mean, we can talk about Yahweh or the Israelite God. He had a consort named Asherah. So is this considered to be, I mean, there's technically, it's Canaanite, but there's she pops up in Israelite texts as well. You can find her in the Torah in certain points in the Hebrew Bible, and I can pull up some examples later. But if women were so subservient, then why mention this consort by name, that God has a wife? You can find it at Kuntilat Ashrut and Iron Age. What I'm studying in late Bronze Age and the transition to the early Iron Age, these figurines that I'm talking about in my thesis, I mean, these are assumed to be Asherah. So I think this is really interesting. Also, I think women do have autonomy over themselves. I mean, if you look in household context, you can find a different kind of religion than you would find in the state. And I know it's a generalization to suppose that, or dichotomize that the house is for women and the temple or the outside of the house is for men. But I also see from a feminist point of view, it can be very, what's the word? Like very invigorating, I don't know, to say that, okay, the women have full autonomy over the house, or maybe not full, but they have their own ways of doing things, how they're kneading the bread and cooking, and what I'm focusing on with more of a religious context, and potentially fertility rituals and how they go about childbirth and childbearing. And I think I saw there was a question about how women are or how children are raised or something in the chat. But that's also really interesting. So that can answer questions or bring up questions about what's the mortality rate and how is childbearing? Is it extremely difficult at this time, or do they have, different ways of helping this and aiding the pregnancy and the birthing process at this time period? And of course, my time period is I'm focusing on an earlier time period than my other colleagues here. So what I might have to say is different than what they'll say a few hundred years later. Yeah.
I would like to speak to this question of the subservience of women within the context of the biblical text. So when we think about the various roles that women are explained as having in the biblical text, one of the themes that becomes fairly noticeable as you read across these stories is that there is certainly a system of differentiation of power between men and women that is assumed by most biblical authors to be the norm. That men seem to, in many regards, be given or granted some kind of extra power in the social world, that's the public world, and the women are often, described as having this similar kinds of power, just like Amanda was saying, but more in the locus of the household. So there are significant differences that we have to attend to. However, there's also this very common theme across these various kinds of stories of what I would call a kind of purposeful indirectness, in which the women who are not necessarily front and center in public life have a large amount of influence in the decision making of male members of the household and in the outcome of public events. So we see this in a variety of stories. In some ways, this pattern follows some of what we would identify broadly in folkloric literature as the work of the trickster, or of a kind of character who is working craftily behind the scenes to bring about certain types of outcomes. So we see this in the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis. We see this in the work that Rebecca is conceiving of as she interacts with Isaac on behalf of Jacob rather than Esau. We see this in the story of Esther and Haman. We see this with Bathsheba when she is petitioning David for Solomon to be the next king rather than the other son who might be the rightful ruler. And we even see this in the story of Absalom and Tamar, where Absalom counsels Tamar to act in a particular way to keep quiet after she has been raped by her half-brother Amnon. There are all kinds of situations in which the behavior of women, as it's at least represented taking place behind the scenes, has some kind of purchase on the reality that people experience. So once again, this comes back to the idea that Tine mentioned earlier that we sometimes refer to as presentism. The idea that our understanding of what subservience looks like between male and female relationships in the 21st century may not be the same way that people understood it in the ancient world. Again, from the anthropological perspective, what we try to maintain here is a certain sense of cultural relativism for the sake of making informed observations. And so that's also at play as we think about how these worlds intersect with our own. Would it be possible for us to answer the question of what daily life was like for women in ancient Israel? I noticed that Amanda was starting to talk about that, and I just saw that question up there, so I want to make sure we answer that one as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, go for it, Tine.
Okay, I just want to say from first of all to comment on Eric's comment. For example, second wave feminism kind of fought for the right of women to go work outside of the house, right? To go work in an office and have the same job as men. And for us modern women, we think that was a good thing. We strive for that. We wanted to go and have a job and be out and be in the public sphere. That doesn't necessarily mean that is what ancient women actually wanted. Maybe for them, they were like, I'd rather stay in the house and rule over all these other tasks that is in here. then go out. Maybe that was not the aim that they had, to go out there and be on the fields every day. They much rather rule the in-house, and maybe they were the ones in charge, saying, okay, now those grains need to be reaped. Now those plants need to be plucked. And they were the one coordinating and charging. We have no idea. So it might be that that was not the powerful role, to go out there and plow the fields, but the opposite. And women, for example, we know from archaeology and texts that they were responsible for, once the food came in, for food coordination and preparation and cooking. And so they were the ones who would put it in a storage room and ration, okay, this is how much we can eat every day if we want to make it through the winter. This is the kind of meals that we're going to make. And then make sure that they had enough to survive, and cook the meals every day and be responsible for all of that. On top of also making the clothing to keep people warm, making the baskets to keep everything in, especially in the beginning, making your own pottery, your own household pottery to eat and cook with. So they had all these tasks that they were responsible for, that were necessary to survive in those circumstances. So I would not see those as minor chores, as like vacuuming the house. They were super important to survive, and so that was a very dominant role, I think, in the ancient society. So yeah, the daily lives, I would say, they did child rearing. Of course, they had mostly a lot of children. There was no protection against that yet. And then also the cooking and the weaving and the whatever. I think it was Carol Myers who wrote in her book that she estimates that women would spend an average of 2 hours every single day making grain into bread. So they would take the grain, they would mash it up, they would get the powder, they would get the flour, they would knead the bread, they would bake it in an oven. That would take 2 hours every single day just to have food at dinner. So a lot of these chores just took a lot of time. And so I think daily life was just occupied by, repairing your clothing, and you have to think that they would make everything themselves, right? They couldn't go to a shop and just buy an IKEA table or whatever. So they had to make all their mats that they sat on, their pillows, their decorations, everything that they ate with, that they used to play, the toys for the babies, like everything. So that would take up a lot of your time just constructing everything. And of course, the men would go to the fields and would go, I don't know, with the sheep and whatever, or the young boys would. And I think women were much more in the household, but doing a lot of very necessary tasks. Amanda.
Yeah, I'm looking through a colleague's dissertation now, trying to find a photo just to show how intensive it was to actually grind this grain. But I mean, it was not easy. You're taking, basically you have a bottom stone and you have a top one, and you're just going like this for 2 hours sometimes, and every day. It's these women were pretty cool. If I find the photo, I'll pull it up in a minute. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to add really. Yeah, like, it's not like modern times, and we can't continue to impose our own cultural and social biases on these, on the ancient times, especially just going from different time periods, from the late bronze to Iron Age 1, Iron Age 2. And then I also wanted to just address a question that just came in that I think is kind of related. So it's, she asks, do you think this has to do with the fact that technology was underdeveloped and that work was more backbreaking? So, I mean, specifically with stone tools and grinding and things like this, it's very backbreaking. It's very intensive. I don't think most people don't do this today in the Western world. If you go to the Middle East, I mean, some people you can do, I think it was Jenny Ebling, she did an ethnography study of modern women in Jordan and Palestine and Israel, in this region, southern Levant, still using some of these stone tools and grinding and making their own pottery and things like this. And so that can give us a better example or better lens of which to look into the ancient world than having our own Western biases growing up for me in Texas or for Tina in Belgium. You know, it's these are totally different worlds, and we have to keep this in mind constantly. And then to also address this question says underdeveloped. We have to remember that just because we have technology now, it does not mean that what they had back in these times 2,000-3,000 years ago was any less, you know, developed or intensive or intelligent than what we have now. I think it's just different ways of living and different ways of seeing the world, different lenses through which we experience life. You know, in the household as well as outside in the state or in a temple or wherever we are. So I just wanted to address that really quickly as well.
There is a question, and we can come back to all of this later in our discussion again, about the Bible. So I'm going to refer that to Dr. Eric, saying, was the poem in Proverbs 31, the one about the good wife, is that an accurate reflection of elite women in 5th century BCE Israel?
Yeah, this is a good question. So this proverb that's often translated as the good wife, the Hebrew there is Eshet Chayil, which means a woman of valor. And to excuse my French, perhaps, I know this is going to be broadcast around the world, but this is perhaps a more accurate translation of this term, Eshet Chayil, is a badass woman. She is somebody who has domains that are extraordinary in a lot of ways. She has full control of her household. She has some business dealings that she's interacting with out and about in the public. So this is a woman who is really somebody who has quite a bit of power in a lot of different social domains. The question of whether or not this is an accurate representation of the life of an everyday woman is a little bit more difficult to answer. My interpretation of this kind of proverb would be that given the authorial context of the people who are responsible for proverbs, this probably would be more descriptive of a woman of an elite status, somebody that has a certain amount of social leeway. She has a certain command over a number of members of the household, probably including servants and even potentially slaves. And so there's more going on here than would be commonplace for a normal woman in the household in ancient Israel, and even a normal man in a household in ancient Israel. In some ways, this is a fairly unique human situation. But again, this is how we see these ideals of femininity or masculinity being presented in one way in the biblical text, and then we have challenges to that sometimes in other texts as well.
Right. And it's not because we have the Hebrew Bible that we can take all of these texts at face value, right? As everybody knows, there's a difference between the idealized utopian society that a writer would want to have and put on paper or on papyrus than reality, right? It's the same what we write or do in our movies or write in our books. There's an ideal situation that we would like to have, and then there's the reality on the ground. And so it would be nice if women had all that power, but probably not. And probably were not that many women who had that kind of power. So it's always hard to assess. And I think my students know that what is bias, a biased reflection by the author about his world and what is reality. Speaking of, these texts were written by men, right? That's another thing that we can bring up. That probably all the texts that we have in the Hebrew Bible were written by men, redacted by men, compiled by men. And so it's mostly their reflections that we see, the topics that they were occupied with. We don't know when we have some normal letters like from Egypt that were conserved, letters that people would write to each other, and then some marriage contracts and whatever. But we don't have long texts that explore the inner worlds of women and what they were occupied with. And so that's where often archaeology comes in, because if we would see, for example, those little statues that Amanda was talking about, those were probably made by women. Why? Because it's the women who make the pottery. So those are also made in pottery, those clay figurines. It's probably the women who made it, and they were representations of women, either of Asherah, as Amanda said, the wife of God, or of themselves, or offering something to God as a representation of themselves. And we think that they were making these as a gift, as an offering, or to pray to, for anything that would want in life, right? Either fertility, to become pregnant, if they had children, to make sure that children stayed healthy, that they would nurse, that they wouldn't get any diseases. And so I think a lot of women were very occupied, just as they are today, with the well-being of their family and making sure everybody is okay and well-fed and happy and nurtured. And so a lot of religion, probably in the household for women, was centered around that. But we don't have that evidence from the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrew Bible text was written by these elite men who had a very different lifestyle, who were concerned about philosophical ideas and about mythologies and about the origin of the world and an ideal society to live in. They weren't really as occupied with let my baby survive its first year, for example. So I think that's also another problem that we have, that we don't have a gateway into the minds of these ancient women.
Yeah, so Tine, can I follow up for 1 second on that? I was struck by one thing that you said that I think is really worth drawing out a bit more. And that is, if women are the primary sources of a lot of the material cultural items that we unearth, then it gives us a way of thinking about cultural production in this time period. If they're responsible for pottery, if they're responsible for the kind of figurines and even tool making, perhaps even toys, religious items used for textile production, then in some ways, this does help balance our picture. If we have texts that are primarily the creation of male elites, and then a lot of the material culture is the production of women's work, that just helps us think here again that we're not looking all the time at a one-sided picture. Sometimes we tend to overemphasize the masculine sources of evidence to the past. And so what you said is a good way to think about that in a tempered manner. So I appreciate that.
Amanda, I see that you're pulling something up.
Yeah, just to, give some reference to what these figurines look like. So here's a full, oops, what just happened here? Here's a full one from biblical Timnah, or modern day Tel Batash. It's located right here. I put a big X. So just so everyone sees what they look like, they're really small and cute. And it very much accentuates, the female body parts. There's always breasts and the pubic triangle and usually larger hips. And she's holding something in her hands. This one also has a very Egyptian style hair, which we could take back to identity negotiation. Our Egyptian and local Israelite women or Canaanite women at this time, talking or having cultural exchange. So this is what they look like.
Right, and that's why we're thinking they have something to do with fertility, right? Because it's the fertility aspects of the woman that are accentuated, the big hips, the breasts used for nurturing the babies. So that's why we think they are not goddesses, but they are more representations of fertility.
Yes, here's another great example from Tel El-Wawiyat in the north. It was a salvage excavation. And this one, is very clearly related to childbearing and, maybe protection of children or something like this.
Right. Thank you. Let's take another question. Were women allowed to have paid jobs? And so what sort of jobs could women work to make money? I first want to say that, so I'm writing my dissertation on coins and coin hoards in ancient synagogues. I know a little bit about money. Money was a relatively late invention if we talk about paid work in money, right? So it was a Persian, it was invented in different places in the world pretty much around the same time. But at the time of the Persian periods, we kind of have money, or at least like silver pieces and whatever. Before that, not really. People always say that there was a barter system, but I don't really believe in a barter system either. Like, what do you do if you have a cow, you don't get like 2,000 eggs for it in return? It's kind of hard. But yes, especially when there was money and et cetera, women were definitely contributing. They could sell their objects, right? The ones they're making. And just as today, people would be experienced or skilled in different aspects. Some people are very artistic. I am not at all. So I would pay somebody else to make me one of those figurines. I could never make that myself. Or I would do something in return, right? Like if you give me one of those figurines, I'll help you build your roof next year, something like that. So they were definitely contributing to the household, or they were exchanging food with each other, right? If somebody has a lot of tomatoes in their garden, another one has a lot of cucumbers, you can switch them out, and then the whole family has more diversity in their diet. So I think women were mostly contributing in that kind of regard. I don't know of a lot of women going out as we would see it today and go work somewhere at a place in city life or something. Maybe other people have more thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, at least within the biblical text, one of the primary examples, and it doesn't happen often, but in terms of women leaving their household or using the public space just beyond their household for economic gain, one of the examples from the Hebrew Bible would be prostitution. And so this is
the oldest profession in the world.
Obviously referred to, yes, the oldest profession in the world. And oftentimes women who use this means of income were not relying on it primarily. And interestingly enough, within the Hebrew Bible, we find several examples of women who are either using prostitution or who are described as prostitutes, who are actually considered to be people of good character, who contribute to Israel's heritage in meaningful ways, and who are doing other work in addition to that particular profession.
Right. Okay, I think that will do. Let's get to some other questions because we have like a lot. So somebody asked, and this is a very long question, so I'm just going to read it out loud. As Judith Butler has persuasively shown, sex is as much of a social construct as gender is. The way we read sex, whether we are looking at genitals or at chromosomes or at bone structure, etc., depends on presupposed, predetermined notions of what constitutes sex. Intersex people undermine such easy binaries. I wonder how what we today call intersexuality was read or represented in ancient cultures. Whew, that's a big one. Eric, that's a social thing.
Yeah, this is social science right on. Yeah, Judith Butler, certainly a good conversation partner to have in the midst of this kind of discussion. Judith Butler would be somebody who would speak about the performative nature of gender identity and even of sexual identity. And so without having a full lecture series devoted to this, we can simply affirm some of the things that are observed in this particular question. And as we think about intersexuality, that term maybe needs to be defined a little bit further. I'm not sure if the question asker could give us a little bit more of a specific definition of what they're working with there. If we're referring specifically to the biological phenomena of intersex individuals, we know that about 2 in 1,000 people, about 0.2% of humans are born either with indeterminate genitalia or with both forms of it. And often in modern medical context, there's a choice made as to which of those genitalia to accentuate. Clearly, we know that this kind of thing would have also been happening in human history. The biology of humans hasn't changed drastically in the last 10,000 years. And so when we start to think about intersexuality, at least within the biblical world, we recognize that there are these areas that maybe are considered gray areas or areas of strangeness in terms of the land between gender, the land between the sexes. This is represented by people like eunuchs or members of the covenant community who have male genitalia, but they've been harmed in some kind of way. Both eunuchs and people with crushed testicles are prohibited from participating in the assembly of the covenant community. And so people in general, people's bodies that didn't function according to the normative roles, and this included people with other types of disabilities. That would be a more modern terminology that would be used. And we recognize there's obviously a range of other terms for describing that particular kind of physical difference among human bodies. But biblical authors tended to be uncertain about those kinds of physical abnormalities they would have thought of them as. And sometimes they thought of them as being religiously problematic. So that would be a brief answer to that particular question without any other specifics about what's meant with the term intersexuality.
Yeah, Eric, I have a question for you that I'm now thinking about when I hear this. So we've talked about the Essenes in my class a lot. So my students know that the Essenes, the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, as we think, were this community. They lived separately, most of them, from the other members of Jewish community around the time 1st century BCE, 1st century CE. And they were an all-male club, and so you could only join if you were a man and of adult age. And so they didn't have any children, they didn't have any women living there. And so one of their prerequisites to enter the club was to be unblemished, as in you couldn't have any disabilities. And so I find it interesting, for example, that we in our modern society have much more to do. We would call racism a thing, where we wouldn't allow people of certain races in our group, especially in the US. But that doesn't seem to be an issue at all. They are only looking at disabilities, which we don't see as a problem, or we don't necessarily discriminate against. So that's a kind of interesting differentiation, and just shows how much of a social construct it is to randomly say that that group is problematic, but that one not, and the other way around a couple of thousand years later. Do you have something to say about that, Eric? This just popped up in my head. I don't want to get too deep here in
No, no, it's okay. I would say, so one of my, I'm not a specialist on the Essene community by any means. So thinking about that far into, in my mind, that's like the distant future from ancient Israelite religion. But when I think about, at least within the biblical text, the normativity of bodies, yeah, the concept of race becomes a really difficult thing to both identify within the biblical text and discuss. At one point, one of the projects that I've been working on for the last number of years is looking at constructions of race and ethnicity in the Bible, particularly in context of migration. And so what we would understand as race in at least modern social science discourse about systems of inequality that have been built on what we would call phenotypic results of genotypic specification. So the physical presentations of underlying genomic representations within the human body, those kinds of phenotypic descriptions aren't always readily present in the biblical text. Now, we do get description of people's skin color occasionally, but when we look at the iconographic record, we actually start to see some more of this kind of information. So I'm thinking specifically of tomb paintings within Egypt. Specifically, we get a lot of colorful tomb paintings, and they certainly represent skin color. And there's certainly a gradient of social hierarchy according to the color of people's skin. So racism as a thing existed in the ancient world. It's not always something that is as explicitly dealt with within the biblical text. Ethnicity, however, is certainly something that is dealt with. And I realize that even within anthropology right now, there is a very good discussion that's happening around whether or not this differentiation between ethnicity and race is even a real thing. So I'm using those terms with caution. But when we talk about the presentations of ethnicity in the biblical text, across the life of the covenant community, we see a variety of conversations about what it means to belong and what are the markers of ethnicity. So we see this in stories like we find within Ezra and Nehemiah. We see this within the book of Ruth, various points in Deuteronomy. So it's there for sure, but we're still trying to learn more about the social worlds of these biblical authors to understand how they viewed these kinds of differences.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah, sorry, it was a long answer to your question.
No, thank you for that. That's just something that popped in my head that I want to do some more research about. Also in archaeology, I know exactly the things that you mean from Egypt. sometimes also on reliefs, right, where people with different hairstyles are like grouped together, because you can see like this is a different African tribe, and that is a different tribe, and whatever, just on the hairstyles or their clothing. So they didn't make differentiations between ethnicities or like where people came from. So yeah. Anyway, let's take another question from the actual audience, and maybe this is one that Amanda can answer. Why are nations considered women or given feminine pronouns, but gods are considered men rather than praying to a goddess? Is that also due to the male elitists who wrote the texts?
Wow, that's an interesting question. Okay, so the first part of it is more, I would say, linguistic. Like nations, modern Hebrew, also cities, or any geographical place really is just in the feminine form of the word. So, you know, Hebrew and other Semitic languages are very gendered. And I know Dr. Trinka could, you know, tell you more about the linguistic part of this. But like you refer to ancient Israel, modern Israel, any place. I grew up in Texas, so I would, any place like this, I would refer to in the feminine form in Hebrew. So there's that. And then to answer the second part, so gods are considered men. It's an interesting thing that I'm working with now, looking at, I'm going back into Canaan in the late Bronze Age, so before Israel is established, and the Israelite people enter into Israel, as we'll go with here. But it's interesting. I mean, you have Baal, Hadad, Yahweh, or Elohim, Adonai, whatever you want to call him, the Israelite God, and they all seem to kind of build off of each other, and they're all fighting. It's, you know, whose God is the best in some of the cases, but you can also see that there are female goddesses as well, especially in Canaanite religion. We have a large corpus of religious and cultic texts from Ugarit, which is in Syria in modern day, or the northern Levant, where there's goddesses of Anat and Asherah. These are coming from, they're probably related to Mesopotamian gods, which goes back even earlier, which would be modern day Iraq. And that would be related to Ishtar. You can also bring in Hathor from Egypt. So there's plenty of female goddesses that are also included. So maybe, I mean, it's a good question. We have both. I don't know why the Israelites decided to go mostly with a male deity of Yahweh. But we do see Asherah pop up sometimes. So if you go to Quintilet Ajrud, there's an inscription that says Yahweh and his Asherah. So there is a female goddess, at least, you know, maybe not by religious terms modern day if you're following Judaism, but we do see goddesses as well. But yeah, to the Judeo-male elitists, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, so there are multiple books written on like the emergence of monotheism and how like religion of ancient Judaism transitions over time, right? And so students of mine will know that in the beginning there were indeed a lot of gods, and people thought that every town or city had its own god, or every tribe had its own god, and they were competing, and like whoever conquered the other tribe must have meant that their god is more powerful, etc. And then slowly transitions into only one god. But that was a long process, and so most people, I think the general public, would think that ancient Judaism was monotheistic from the beginning, but that took many, many centuries. And even in the Hebrew Bible, we still have examples of people worshiping other gods, or they were told not to worship other gods, which means that they were still doing it. For example, there's a story in the Bible where it says women were baking cakes for the Queen of Heaven. And so it was, again, women who were making these cakes, making bread in a sort of shape to offer to the Queen of Heaven. And we don't know who the Queen of Heaven is. We think it might be Asherah. And so there's an example of how women were 500 years after the Iron Age period began, we were still worshiping this queen or this goddess. We know from other texts that they often would put wooden sticks or poles or trees around the sanctuary that we think are symbolic representations of that Asherah. And so we have in texts that the king commands, or the leader commands, that these poles need to be cut down, or that these trees need to be removed. So he's trying to get rid of all this idolatry or worshiping of a goddess. And so I think it is a male elitist thing that orthodoxy became, you can only worship one God, but it took a long time, and I think it maybe even never left, that other people, just like in Catholicism, where people still worship Mary and saints or whatever, even though Christianity is monotheistic. It doesn't mean that you don't have little statues of Mary around, like my grandma, or saints in Russian or Orthodoxy. So yeah, I think it was the male elitists that were trying to put that in their text, and were trying to get all the power into one place. And so that's what scholars are saying, that there might have been multiple reasons for why that happened. Could have been that when Saul and David were warriors, that they chose a big warrior god to worship, and so that god was kind of seen as a warrior, and so he became the patron of their conquering of the territory, and so that's why he became their symbol and so important, while the female goddesses were mostly seen as nurturing, or mostly seen as other roles within society, not necessarily a strong conqueror. What was I going to say? Oh, and also that the people who probably wrote these texts were living around Jerusalem, or were involved in the temple. And so they wanted the temple to be the only place where people came to worship. Because if they would come and worship there, then they would bring money and offerings and food and whatever. And they would think that the priests there, were the most important people in society that you had to ask authority from and ask questions from, et cetera, et cetera. And so the more power that they could console within that little group of people, the better. So if you outlaw the worship of other goddesses, you outlaw little shrines and temples everywhere around, you outlaw sacrificing at home, and you bring it all to one place, then you have ultimate power over everybody and everybody's religion. And if you can put it under one God, that's much more easier to understand than if you have multiple gods. So that's what people are also thinking, that might have been the reason for why that became monotheistic over time. But that's just from my own research. So I don't know, Eric, if you want to add something to that. If not, that's fine.
I don't need to add too much to that. I think
Okay.
you did a good job.
Okay.
We can also add,
Go
really,
ahead.
later on, so not in the early figurines there, and relating it to Asherah and having poles and trees and things like this. So if you go back into the Iron Age too, the figurines also evolved. This is just what I'm going with my research. But these women are also shown holding tambourines or maybe cakes. We don't really know exactly what it is. I can pull up one example. But going off of earlier, someone asked, what do women do and sorts of things like this. So, they also play music. If you go, and of course, Eric can talk more about it, but like the Song of Miriam, women are always, they're the ones that are singing or cheering after an event, a victory, success, something. So I'm just thinking out loud, but maybe they're related here. So there's tambourines as well as baking cakes and things like this later on. As Israel is becoming more established, or the Israelite people, whether you want to call it a culture, ethnicity, or whatever, we won't get into the anthropological debate there, but so I just wanted to point out here, I think I saw another one. I don't know if this is supposed to be a cake or a tambourine or some musical instrument, but so these are later than what my master's thesis is actually on.
Great. Let's take another question. What is the purpose of male biblical authors in subverting gender roles and presenting powerful feminine leaders? Why are they doing that? This is tricky because my students are writing their papers for the moment, and a lot of them are analyzing Judith, and that's kind of the kind of question that I want them to get to in their own papers, and now we're going to give it away, but that's okay. Eric,
should we not say anything? Yeah, maybe.
Go ahead.
I guess this is a way to see how many of your students are actually attending this, Tina, because maybe you'll be able to measure in the papers as they show up. Yeah, so this is a really hard question because on one level, what you have to do with this question is try to get into the minds of the biblical authors, and that requires us to deal with authorial intention, and that's not always something we have an easy grasp on. But what I will say is that what this demonstrates to us is a phenomenon that we know broadly occurs in most forms of religion and religiosity. And by most, I really do mean all. I can't think of any exceptions of this, but I'm going to hold out there and say most. This phenomenon is known as internal religious pluralism. And what this phenomenon is a description of the elasticity of religious practices. So we have a range of social spheres that people are a part of simultaneously, and they have different kinds of discursive identities, to use that terminology again, where different elements of themselves are accentuated in these different contexts. And when we think about this, what we recognize is that people act differently in different settings. That's the common sense way of thinking about it, or maybe the plain sense way of describing it. So one of the interesting things I think we see in the biblical text with this particular instance of male elite biblical authors using these kinds of stories, or including these stories of women who are subversively challenging systems or structures of power, this demonstrates an internal religious pluralism among the various conversation partners that are writing these texts. And what's fascinating about this is that it seems to be a part of the biblical tradition to preserve diversity. That there is an intentional collocation or collection of diverse perspectives and an inclusion of them. And so this makes some readers of the Bible a little uncomfortable because they tend to think of these things as contradictions to one another rather than conversations with one another. So just like I was saying earlier about Ezra and Nehemiah having very different perspectives on ethnicity than the author of Ruth does, these particular authors who are responsible for the text, the editors thought both of these texts were worth including. And so they maintain them there. And this actually, coming back to what Tina was saying about the Essene community at Qumran, this seems to also be something that pertains to that community. There was a collection of texts found there among the different finds in the Judean desert that shows a really wide range of religious texts, and maybe even the collection of texts that the community wouldn't necessarily have even supported in their own personal religious beliefs or practices. But the preservation of diverse texts seems to be a part of the biblical tradition. So perhaps that is one of the things that's driving the collection of these kinds of stories of subversive women. That's all I can say for now on this. I don't really know exactly why, but this is a question that I've actually been quite preoccupied with, and perhaps someday there will be a monograph that has an attempt at an answer.
Good. I think I want to leave that with that for now. So people do your research on Judith. There are a couple of really good articles written about why people think Judith was chosen. Some of them feminists saying, well, they really liked a strong woman. Some of them anti-feminists saying that they wanted to choose the weakest person available to make the story even more impressive. So that is not a flattering idea for women. Another question. We have 10 more minutes. So if you want to send in your questions, we have a couple of more minutes to go for the final questions. This is a New Testament question. So I don't know, Eric and Amanda, how you are on the New Testament, but would any of the Gospels be considered male elitist? Whew. Who
Wow.
would take a stab at that?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I do teach New Testament, so I guess I'm on the hook for this one. I think it's a difficult question because to understand what we mean by male elitist is a challenging thing to define in perhaps the Roman period when the Gospels would have been written. So it's certain, I would say we're almost certain, like 99.9% sure, that the Gospels are authored by a male of some kind. Okay, each one of these has a male author. Perhaps there is one text in the New Testament that some have argued was written by one of Paul's female co-workers, and that would be the book of Hebrews, or the letter to the Hebrews, sometimes understood as the sermon to the Hebrews. But when we think about the Gospels, it's challenging to know exactly how each one of these gospel authors is trying to use the various symbolic worlds of the New Testament era to say something about who Jesus is. The primary purpose of the Gospels is not so much to give us an accurate historical picture of the events of the early church. It's not so much to even give us an accurate historical picture of Roman society. It is to make theological claims about who Jesus is as he's understood within the context of Judaism and in response to imperial systems of Roman dominance. So within that world, I would say the intention of the authors of the Gospels is not really to give a kind of commentary on gender relationships. We do, however, in the Gospels see Jesus interacting with women in a variety of ways. And some of those ways seem to fly in the face of perhaps Jewish or Roman culture, cultural norms of the time. And in other instances, they seem to substantiate those norms. But to say simply that this is a product of a male elite society is challenging, because we know that the social dynamics of the early church were really egalitarian in some respects and not egalitarian in others. And by the 2nd century, that began to change dramatically. But at least early on, when some of these Gospels would have been written, we're thinking here about a Christian community around the Mediterranean that was working out some of those gender differences in a way that would have been radical for the time.
Right. And I think it's also difficult to understand what elitist means, right? Because when we say elitist and somebody else asks, does the idea of a writer being a male elitist belittle their credibility? Right. When I say it's a male elitist, I'm not thinking about that in a negative way. I am not saying, oh, he's an elitist. I'm just saying only certain people had access to education, so could write these kind of texts and were educated enough to put puns in texts and parallelism and poetry and whatever. So they were upper class, or they were educated, they were well off, they were whatever, they were smart. That doesn't mean that I don't perceive it as something negative. It's just a term to say they belong to a certain different class than the average person was. And so I don't mean to belittle it, but it does mean that it comes with a certain perspective and a certain bias, and that they have different questions in life than what the average person would have. And I come back to what I said earlier. They might probably not care as much about where does my daily bread come from, because they're well fed. Or they might not care about, so they had more, I think, leisure time to think about the bigger questions about theology, about philosophy, about theory, and wrote about those kind of things in their texts. So it's a different lens that we get on society, but that doesn't mean that what they write about society is not credible. If they talk about people or places or whatever, those probably existed and were located where they say they were. It's just that they are approaching topics from a different angle. You guys have comments on that? No? Okay. So in the last couple of minutes, what should we talk about? I still have a couple of topics that we said beforehand that we would talk about. The women of the wall, female and male spaces, sacrifice, necromancy, leadership roles. Any of these that you still, Amanda or Eric, want to get your opinion out?
I think really quickly, we didn't really brainstorm it before coming on live, but I think it would be interesting to talk about creation narratives a little bit more, and the role of the feminine, or of maybe goddesses, whatever you want to relate them to. But I think it's really interesting that many creation stories or narratives have women and their role in this. Like if you go to Mesopotamia, which Genesis, the creation narrative of the Israelites, and later also going into the New Testament, this is based off of Enuma Elish from Mesopotamia, which is everything was created by Tiamat, which is a feminine god or deity. So I think this is really interesting that there was a question talking about how I don't remember where it is. If I find it, I'll say the name. But it's talking about male elitists and how we're praying to a male god or deity and not a female. But in reality, to these different groups, the world was created by a female deity or a female figure of some sort. So I think that's really interesting and important to point out.
Mm-hmm. I think people in those societies had a very different relationship with fertility and with childbearing, right? They live in a world where that is seen as much more natural than it is to us. I feel like sometimes with us, childcare, birth, whatever, is kind of a taboo subject. Where for a lot of these ancient cultures, that was just daily life, right? People would die in childbirth. There were all kind of complications and consequences, and so no wonder that they were praying for a healthy child and a safe pregnancy and whatever. And I think that they had a lot more respect for what it meant to be pregnant and go through that, and your body going through that, because they saw it all around them, right? And so I think that is where the worshiping of a female goddess who birthed the earth or birthed culture comes from, because that's where people come from women. Eric.
Oh, sorry, I would just affirm what both of you have said, that many of these creation myths, they draw on gendered motifs, partially because of how the humans who are responsible for them thought about their relationships to the divine in gendered terms. It is really important, at least within the study of the Hebrew Bible, to name that there are certainly times throughout biblical texts where God is referred to using feminine language. It is by no means the dominant way that biblical authors refer to God, but it is present. And one of the important ways that it's present in terms of creation myths is in Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 2. There, as it's often translated, there the Spirit of God swept over the waters, or a wind from God swept over the waters. This ruach, this wind from God or spirit, is described using feminine terminology. The participle that we know of in Hebrew, which is merachefet, this is what the action that this spirit is doing. This word is translated as swept often, but it really means something more akin to like vibrating or fluttering. And the way that this word is often used is to describe what mother birds do when they're incubating their eggs.
Oh, wow.
And so at the beginning of the world, this chaos of the waters of chaos is being nurtured into existence by the feminine spirit of God that's incubating it like a mother hen. And so right from the beginning, we get this kind of feminine imagery, and we should be paying attention to that.
Right. Thank you. I think we are at the end of our session. Thank you so much again, Dr. Eric Trinka and Amanda Bauer, for being here and being with me. I think this was super useful. Also to my students, because gender is, in fact, a topic that we don't really touch upon in my class. So this was a good interjection for them to get a little bit of perspective on that theme. Next week, we will have another Ask an Expert Q&A live session, not with me, but led by Dr. Pinar Durgam. And it will be about death and burial in the ancient world, specifically in the ancient East, which is going to be super interesting. I'm going to be there. It's on Halloween, so it's like a fitting topic. But Pinar is amazing. And I don't know who she invited, but I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. And then the week after that, we are doing another video game session. So that will be with me. And we will be playing Civilization 6. And in Civ, as we call it, we will look at how different cultures are represented in the video games. Are they historically accurate or not? And why would people who make these games represent the ancient world in that specific way? What is their goal, etc.? So that is what we're going to do for the next couple of weeks. So I hope that everybody who has been on here for the first time signs up for our newsletter. We will have events every week. We do other things in the spring semester. Follow us on social media. You can follow me on Twitter as well. I'm Tine Rassalle. I'm also on there. But definitely Sasa to keep up with everything that we do. And thank you for being here. This was great. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.